Hi, and welcome to our Tracking Domestic Violence Perpetrators webinar, sponsored by Attenti Prod360 Inc. COVID-19 has shed light on the ongoing issue of domestic violence in Canada. The Canadian government also lists violence against women and children as one of the most significant societal issues endangering Canadians' health and well-being, and have said the pandemic has made these problems more severe. A recent Statistics Canada analysis of data collected from 17 police forces across the country shows that calls related to domestic disturbances rose by 12% between March and June of 2020, compared to the same 4 months in 2019. Some provinces, like Quebec, have begun taking action to combat this growing issue. The province reported 10 women have already been killed by male partners in the first 4 months of 2021. In response, the provincial government announced a $223 million investment over 5 years in the fight against domestic violence. To illustrate this problem, we will now share a pre-recorded video from Natalie Trotti, a Quebec-based survivor of domestic violence, before we move into the live portion of our webinar. It is in French, but subtitles will play in English at the bottom of your screen.
Bonjour, je me présente. Je suis Nathalie Trottier, conférencière, artiste peintre, survivante de violences conjugales. Je fais également partie du comité d'experts en vécu à Tragédie de l'Université de Montréal. Et oui, je suis également porte-parole de Transit Secours qui offre des services de déménagement et d'entreposage totalement gratuits pour les victimes de violences conjugales. J'ai vécu 25 ans dans une dynamique de violence conjugale de 16 à 41 ans. J'ai subi toutes les formes de violence, que ce soit verbale, psychologique, sociale, économique, physique ou sexuelle. Mais depuis 2012, j'en ai fait mon cheval de bataille. En fait, c'est ma façon de transcender tout ce négatif en positif. Ça donne un sens à ma vie de pouvoir être le porte-voix de toutes celles isolées dans le silence et le noir, remplies de désespoir. Être la voix de celles parties trop vite, parties trop tôt. Prendre la parole au nom de tous ces enfants qui deviendront jamais grands. Au nom de tous ces enfants qui grandiront sans leur maman. Au nom de tous les amis, parents, familles, qui aujourd'hui pleurent la perte de leur fille. C'est assez, pas une de plus. Pendant de nombreuses années, j'étais envahie quotidiennement par cette peur qui vous tyrannise et vous paralyse. Je me réveillais le matin, encore épuisée de la veille, avec ce nœud dans l'estomac qui ne vous quitte pas. Il vient ce moment où tu en as vraiment assez. Tu frappes sur la table avec tes deux mains et tu lui cries par la tête « Hey, c'est fini, je suis plus capable de t'endurer, as-tu compris? » Mais là, il ne manque pas de te le faire payer. Tout près de ta main juste à côté, il empoigne un stylo, puis bang, dans ta main, il s'empresse de l'enfoncer. Prise de panique, évidemment, je me suis mise à hurler. Il m'a jeté par terre, s'empressant de me chevaucher pour m'empêcher de crier. Du coup, il a commencé à m'étrangler. Là, ce qu'il veut, c'est dominer, évidemment, mais il finit par me lâcher. Je reprends tout juste mon souffle et il me crie par la tête « Tu vois là ce que tu me fais faire? Ben, tu l'as bien cherché. » Belle façon de se déculpabiliser. Il y avait également toutes ces petites phrases assassines qui vous glacent le sang, comme par exemple « Tu le sais que je ne peux pas vivre sans toi, mais moi, je le sais sans qui tu ne peux pas vivre. Si tu pars, je vais me tuer avec les enfants. » Ou encore « Elles sont où tes chaînes? Tu veux t'en aller? Ben va-t'en. C'est à toi de voir si tu as envie de faire la une des journaux prochainement. » Je ne voulais tout simplement pas prendre le risque de mettre à exécution ces macabres intentions. Alors, tu restes, tu t'oublies et tu suis. Je suis allée à 8 reprises en maison d'hébergement d'urgence, chaque fois remplie de culpabilité envers mes enfants. De reculons, je retournais à la maison. Naïvement, je croyais à ses remords et j'acceptais son pardon. En dépression majeure, j'avais perdu goût à la vie. 3 tentatives de suicide en témoignent. Mais heureusement, je suis encore ici aujourd'hui. C'est donc le 3 juin 2012 que je me suis enfin choisie, laissant tout derrière moi, mon ancienne vie et mes acquis. Mais heureusement, avec le soutien indéfectible du réseau des CAVAC et d'IVAC, j'ai pu enfin reprendre le gouvernail de ma vie. Pourquoi aujourd'hui je vous raconte mon histoire? C'est simplement en quelque sorte ma contribution à un éventuel changement. Si de cette façon je contribue à apaiser une douleur, à réconforter, à redonner espoir en des jours meilleurs, alors j'en sors grandi, mission accomplie. Maintenant, plus que jamais, il y a urgence. Nous devons sanctionner plus vite, plus fort et davantage. La violence est un problème de santé majeur. Il faut pouvoir travailler côte à côte sur cet enjeu sociétal qui prend malheureusement des proportions pandémiques. Comment le Canada pourrait lutter contre les féminicides afin d'assurer sécurité, dignité et liberté aux femmes? Je crois que la solution, en fait, est multifactorielle. Comme par exemple, tout le système judiciaire canadien, les corps policiers, les professionnels de la santé, les intervenants sociaux et plusieurs autres doivent revoir leur fonctionnement et faire des changements qui s'imposent. Être mieux formés. L'urgence d'agir et le besoin pour les organismes de recevoir un financement nécessaire pour pouvoir répondre à la demande. D'avoir davantage d'investissements pour les logements sociaux. Continuer de mobiliser, de sensibiliser le public et les employeurs aux signes avertisseurs de la violence faite aux femmes et faire en sorte qu'une prise de conscience générale s'opère. Il faut mettre en place un tribunal spécialisé et un ministère entièrement consacré à la violence conjugale, que ce soit centralisé dans une seule entité. Cette façon de faire permettrait d'agir plus rapidement et convenablement et efficacement. La rapidité à instruire un dossier a comme conséquence d'éviter aux victimes de rester à la merci de leur agresseur dans l'attente d'un jugement. Ce qui a comme conséquence qu'elles se découragent, qu'elles retirent leur plainte et finissent par accepter un 810, qui leur procure évidemment un faux sentiment de sécurité. Il faudrait intervenir auprès des hommes au comportement violent, leur offrir des thérapies pour qu'ils puissent enfin prendre conscience des conséquences de leurs gestes. Que les peines prévues à l'encontre des agresseurs soient évidemment plus sévères. N'oublions pas qu'un homme violent est un homme imprévisible. Il doit donc être soumis à une surveillance policière. Alors voilà pourquoi l'utilisation du dispositif anti-rapprochement pourrait faire une énorme différence et sauver la vie de nombreuses femmes et leurs enfants. En Espagne, le bracelet électronique a démontré son efficacité. Depuis sa mise en place en 2008, aucune femme porteuse de balises n'a été assassinée. Leurs statistiques indiquent qu'en 2008, il y a eu 76 féminicides et que 10 ans plus tard, en 2018, le nombre avait diminué à 47. Pour cette même année 2018, au Canada, ici, où la population est beaucoup plus inférieure à l'Espagne, on comptait 121 femmes assassinées. Cela dit, je me demande qu'est-ce qu'on attend pour s'inspirer d'un modèle qui a fait ses preuves depuis de nombreuses années. C'est en faisant des changements concrets, en agissant en commun, que nous donnerons la force et le courage à de nombreuses femmes de dénoncer, de savoir qu'elles sont crues et appuyé par la société, voilà toute une nouvelle dimension qui serait apportée. N'oubliez pas que chaque homme violent était à la source un enfant. Alors éduquons nos fils pour qu'ils deviennent des gentlemen. Éduquons nos filles pour qu'elles n'acceptent aucune forme de violence. Apprenons-leur le respect, l'estime, l'affirmation et l'amour de soi. Vous savez quoi? Aujourd'hui, je suis fière de moi. Je crois que du moment où l'on décide de choisir et de se prendre en main, on peut arriver à changer de route et à trouver le bon chemin. En revanche, je ne veux pas vous faire croire que c'est facile. Je désire seulement vous convaincre que les différentes ressources existantes ont pour moi fait toute la différence. Jamais ces gens ne pourront mesurer la profondeur de ma reconnaissance. Je leur dis merci. Merci de contribuer à changer des vies. En fait, je devrais plutôt dire à sauver des vies. Enfin, du moins, d'avoir sauvé la mienne. Merci.
Okay. We will now move into the live portion of the event where we will address domestic violence calls and present solutions for victims and police alike. We are joined live by a survivor of domestic violence, Julie Waters, who will share her story. We are also joined by Inspector Terry Turner, a police officer with the Waterloo Regional Police Service. Terry has served for the force for 22 years and most recently served as a staff sergeant in their intimate partner violence unit. In October, she was elected as the chair of the Ontario Intimate Partner Violence Coordinators Network and continues to work towards ending violence in intimate relationships. I will now turn things over to Matt Previtt, manager of Attenti. He will be facilitating the conversation today. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Brianna. Good morning, everyone. As Brianna says, I represent Attenti. So I'll do a brief overview of Attenti and a bit of introduction to me before we move on and chat to Julie. So who are Attenti? Well, Attenti are a global provider of electronic monitoring solutions. We make the tags, we make devices that are carried, and we make the software that controls them. We work throughout the world. For instance, in the USA, we have over 24 state contracts. We work in Australia, New Zealand, and in Europe, in the UK, and in Germany, Austria, and in Spain and Portugal, where we have two of the biggest DV contracts in the world. Our technology base includes GPS trackers that are fitted around the ankle, GPS trackers that are carried, RF tags, and a combination of all of the above. The systems are used to enforce various conditions, and that could be license conditions for release from prison or baileys, home detention curfew, or in this case, non-molestation orders or restraining orders in the cases of domestic violence. Every day we monitor about 80,000 people all over the globe. It's literally all we do. So we like to think of ourselves as a specialist in this field. A little bit about me. I've been working in the criminal justice space for 10 years. Providing technology solutions principally into the police across biometrics, ANPR, and tagging. More recently, specialising in tagging with Attenti, and I have this subject is very close to my heart. I've worked closely with stakeholders, police forces, and central government to try and change or improve the way that the British government deals with domestic violence, and I'm pleased to say that the back end of last week, the legislation was changed in England and Wales to improve the measures that the government takes to combat domestic violence. And some of those measures included improved powers around electronic monitoring, which I think is fantastic for survivors and victims. So we make a system which is called the Attenti bilateral DV deterrence solution, and we have it deployed a number of big projects in Spain and Portugal, Argentina, Uruguay, to mention a few. And I'm really pleased that the Canadian government is taking a step in the right direction to consider this type of technology, because I think it really has a huge benefit for survivors and victims, and can potentially reduce violent encounters. So we now have a brief video which will show you what the technology can do. It takes a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on to the interview section. Could you play the video, please, Kate?
This is Janet. Janet is a victim of domestic violence who is trying to carry on with her life normally. Domestic violence is a global problem, affecting an increasing number of victims year on year. One of the common solutions to protect victims of domestic violence is a restraining order imposed by the authorities. But even when restraining orders are in place, it's difficult to enforce them and prevent potential encounters. Attenti has developed a unique domestic violence deterrence system that monitors restraining orders for the purpose of improving the victim's life significantly. The system is based on a bilateral monitoring solution that has already been successfully deployed in several countries. The aggressor is fitted with a GPS tracking unit and an ankle bracelet, while the victim carries a portable device providing the victim with peace of mind. Both the victim and aggressor are supervised by Attenti's monitoring system, which processes events and location data from their devices. In case of a potential encounter, both the victim and the monitoring center are notified. The monitoring center handles the incident according to their response protocol, while instructing the victim to take necessary precautions and go somewhere safe to avoid meeting the aggressor. If the aggressor approaches a restricted area, such as the victim's home, the victim is notified and the aggressor receives a warning message to leave the area. Once the threat of an encounter has passed, the victim is contacted and informed that the incident has been closed. We believe that it's in our hands to provide domestic violence victims the security they need and the freedom they deserve. Attenti. Feeling safe anytime, anywhere.
Great, thank you, Kate. So now we'll move on to the interview discussion section. Can I just say that if we're hoping to get, well, we're going to get through 2 interviews. If there's time, we'll be taking questions at the end. If we don't quite get there, we encourage you to send questions anyway, and we will obviously do our best to come back to you within the next day or 2 with responses, but hopefully there'll be enough time at the end. So, hi Julie.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Excellent. So I'm really intrigued to talk to you this afternoon, about your experiences. So I thought, it's probably best to start at the beginning. I'm interested to understand how your situation unfolded and how you became involved with the person you became involved with, and how they ended up causing you so much pain and discomfort.
Well, I was in 2 separate situations. The first one, it wasn't a very special introduction. We met on Tinder, which is a dating app.
Yeah.
And the second one, I met through a high school friend of mine. So either way you go, it wasn't that great.
Yeah, right, okay. And what were there any early warning signs, and how did it sort of develop from something that seemed, I suppose, like a healthy relationship into something that wasn't? Were there any warning signs?
I didn't notice any warning signs particularly.
Yeah.
The first one, it was a long process. He groomed me from the beginning.
Wow.
Creating what I thought at the time would be the truth, and he manipulated me to believe that there was nobody else that I can turn to for help, especially law enforcement. So when eventually he did get picked up for someone witnessing him punching me in the face, I didn't feel comfortable going and answering the police officer's questions, and I didn't know who I could trust. And eventually I did wind up back in his arms again because I didn't know where else to go.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any other examples of what you went through, Julie?
Well, the worst part of it, he held me captive in my tiny little Hyundai Elantra for about 10 months. I was only allowed to leave when he gave me permission to leave. We were living in that vehicle at that point. And he would work doing exterior work to houses or roofing, and I was not allowed to work. I was not allowed to leave my car at all. He would take the car keys with him and watch me all day while he worked. one day I did try to leave. I tried to go to the washroom at a cafe down the street. When I got back, he harassed me with questions and threats. And that night, he would punch me all throughout the night, choke me, just to teach me a lesson that I can't leave without his permission. Another time, we were driving from Toronto to Waterloo, which is about an hour's drive. I was crying because I had to sleep in my tiny little car, which was crammed with all of my life's things in the trunk. And he told me that that wasn't a good enough reason to cry. And he proceeded to punch me repeatedly for that entire hour's drive. And then when he saw my face starting to grow and swell up, it would make him more mad and hit me even harder or hit me even more. So I had to look at him, tell him that everything was fine. And we made an action plan together of a story that we would tell everybody why my face looks like that, just so I could get back to somewhere safe and not die. So that
Wow.
was the worst of it.
Yeah, that's terrible. That's really, really terrible. I mean, I was going to ask sort of why did you stay, but it sort of sounds like you didn't really have a lot of choice, and that's really
No, I
shocking.
didn't. And
Yeah.
he was also threatening the lives of my family and my friends. So if I would leave, he would go after them and he would hurt them. And I'd seen him hurt numerous people, so I knew what he was capable of. So I didn't know where to go.
No. And did tell me, did any of your friends and family notice a change? Were you seeing them? I mean, what was their?
I basically cut them off.
Yeah.
They would text me and try to call me and see if I needed help, and I would tell them that everything's fine, there's nothing they could do. And then most of the time, if they would message me, I would just look at the message and not respond at all. I kept in contact with my parents. They were a huge support. I wasn't allowed to see them really. But mostly he allowed me to talk to them because they would provide funds for us financially to go get food or pay for my car. So they
Wow.
were a great support and they had no idea what I was going through.
No. Shocking. So how did it all come to an end, Julie?
One day he accidentally left the keys in the car. I noticed them and he was on a massive, beautiful roof working on it. I jumped over and I drove away. I dropped all his stuff at his brother's house and I went to my aunt's.
Right.
So it was literally an escape for my life.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So to moving on, I mean, it sounds incredibly difficult, but how difficult is it to recover from what you've been through?
It's been extremely difficult. I had about $40,000 worth of debt. I had this little Elantra that's now beat up from him punching it, throwing things, throwing my phones through windows, all this stuff. So I had to fix off my brand new car that I had before going into this relationship. I had to pay off 40 grand in debt. But the worst part was the mentality of it. I went through a lot of counseling to get where I needed to be, to have a positive mindset, to reassure me that this wasn't my fault. And there are people out in the world that will help and that want to help and that don't want these things to happen in the world.
Yeah. How long ago are we talking, Julie?
Well, my last relationship I left in 2018. I did about a year and a half of counseling with this wonderful counselor. She was great.
Yeah.
And financially, I just got caught up at the end of 2020. I got rid of my beat up old Elantra and traded it in for a Jeep Wrangler to celebrate the end of my debt.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. To tell me, I mean, you've obviously been through a lot. How have you used your voice and your experiences since you left all that behind and had the counselling?
I haven't been able to do as much as I would like due to COVID. Before COVID hit, I told my story in writing form. I didn't speak it at a conference locally. I would like to do more events to get the word out there, to speak for people who can't share their voice or are too scared to share their voice or whatever their story may be. In the future, I want to get my yoga yoga teaching certificate and provide yoga classes to the women in shelters or the women recently out of these situations, because yoga has been a huge support for me.
Has it? Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, excellent. So sort of a more general question, how do you think things can be improved for victims and survivors of domestic violence? What would you like to see be done in your
Well, when I left the second relationship, I realized I needed a lot more help. I couldn't go to a women's shelter because I had my dog with me.
Right.
I found it difficult to get housing I needed at the time without losing my dog, and she was very reactive, so it was very hard that way too, because she went through a lot of abuse too.
Yeah.
And a number of times where I attempted to get medical answers to my face, to my nerve endings, from being punched and choked so much. But because I'm not injured at the time, I've been having difficulties being taken serious or getting overlooked that it's too late to find these answers. But I would still like to get an understanding of the type of damage that was done to me. But I currently just can't.
No.
The repercussions also to the offenders, I think, needs to be harsher. The abuser that held me captive for 10 months and beat me to inches of my life on multiple occasions, he only got 30 days of weekends in jail, and the second offender was only just probation. So I think there needs to be something harsher. So when you actually get an assault charge, a lot of times it's their sentences from 6 months to years in prison. But it's not the same harshness in domestic violence assaulters.
Yeah, yeah. So just coming back to when things started to turn around for you, I mean, could you tell us how you felt when when things started to sort of improve? How did that make you feel?
It didn't feel like I was improving at all. For a long time, I would just sit on the couch with my dog at my parents' house, and all I could do is go to work because I knew I had to, and go home and just sit there watching TV. I didn't know what else to do. So it was just kind of like a comatose state for a long, long time, until just one day I looked around and I think, oh, okay, things are getting better, even though it didn't seem so at the time. I was pulling myself out of it.
Yeah, yeah. Do you know what's happened to him? What's his situation? Is he in prison? Is he out there? Is he?
He went to prison 30 days weekends.
Yeah.
He was working odd jobs. He never really had an employer. And then after a while, he had to stay at the courthouse because there was a lot of other people that he had done the same thing to or hurt them in other ways. And so he had to stay at the courthouse so he wouldn't get killed. So it was kind of an interesting turnaround there. And so I just went on with my life, and he seems to be living on the streets still and struggling daily.
Really? Yeah, yeah. You said there were two instances or two perpetrators. Were there any similarities? You know, were there any similarities between the two situations, two individuals?
Yeah, well, they both didn't really have a constant job. They couldn't keep a job.
Yeah.
The second situation was more like a one-time thing that happened. As soon as he choked me out, I was like, "Kate, nope, not doing this again," and I got out of there right away.
Right. Okay. Did they sort of present in the same way?
No, I think I still had the same mindset from the first one to the second one because I didn't get any counseling in between the two of them. I didn't understand what was wrong with my thinking of what love was. And so I was already manipulated when I went into that situation with the second one, that I couldn't trust anyone else but this one person. So it was very easy for him. And then once he physically hurt me, that's when I realized what was happening, and I couldn't do it.
How quickly did it move from a sort of what you'd call a regular relationship into something that was more violent?
Oh, just hours.
Wow.
There's just one thing that seemed to set him off, and to this day, I don't really know what it was. And I got the vibe, and so I told the people that I was living with, I'm like, hey, something doesn't feel right about this situation. Can you just keep an eye out, keep an ear out? I'll yell for you. And that's exactly what happened. I yelled. They came to my help, and we got the police there as soon as possible.
Okay. Was that the same in both cases?
No. The first case, I didn't trust going to the police at all. So
Right.
I just grabbed my things and I left and I hid.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think, looking at the electronic monitoring system that we just showed a minute ago, do you think could that have helped your situation, if knowing that he would be tracked and you'd have a device that perhaps would tell you where he was? How that would made you feel safer, do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
For years afterwards, I wouldn't leave the house because I didn't know where he was. I couldn't get any updates. I didn't want to talk to his family in case they had connections with him. So for years, I just hid by myself, not knowing what to do. So knowing that it would be safe to go out into society again would have been a great comfort.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we hear elsewhere. So we're really hoping that, the Quebecian government will kick things off, and this will be the start of life improving for survivors.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting a few questions in on text. How do you think women in your situation can get more help? Any advice to anybody?
Well, especially for women with animals, you don't just want to leave them behind. You want to do everything you can to make sure that they're okay. Especially with my dog, she was very reactive. So I knew if I surrendered her to a shelter, she would have been put down. So more support in that way. I think that's the only big thing that I could do at the time, and maybe pushing for immediate medical care once they become out of those situations.
Yeah, okay. And if we could sort of hone in on the police, what were you said the first situation you felt too scared to go to the police, but in the second time, what were your experiences of the police when
The
you did
second
approach?
time, it was incredible.
Yeah.
So the first time, they kind of ambushed me. They told me they were at my parents' house. Somebody had witnessed me getting hit on the highway. So they went to my parents' house and they told my parents to call me and tell me my dog was dying. So I would come home, and then when I came home, they met me there. So it kind of reinforced the trickery that he told me that would happen. But the second time when they got there, they took me immediately to the emergency room. They got me fully checked out, unlike the first time. And they had a counselor there who specializes in domestic violence. She met me there. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. She asked me a whole bunch of questions. She asked me how I was doing. She gave me her number, and we went from there. It went right into the counseling service. It was great.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And the first time, did you say you didn't tell the police the first time, or it was a different experience?
Yeah, well, I was already manipulated by him. And then for them to tell me, hey, your dog is dying, just to get me to meet with them. So I went there. I didn't want to answer any of their questions, but we went to the station. I told them what we did, what happened, just very briefly. I didn't tell them what I needed because I didn't really know what I needed for support at that time. And then they just let me go on my way. And a few weeks after that, I was back in his arms because he was the only, first of all, he's threatening to kill my family. Second of all, I told the police things that he told me not to tell them. So he's definitely be after us. So I felt like I had to go back to him to make sure that my family was safe. and forget about my physical safety.
Yeah, it's a really, really challenging situation. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we move on to speak to Terry? Any other suggestions?
No, I'm happy to answer questions later on as well if you need me to.
Okay, yeah, okay, fantastic. Thanks very much for your time, Julie. Well, that was fascinating and heartbreaking all at the same time, but glad to hear that you're doing better now. So we'll move on to Terry Turner, Inspector Terry Turner from Waterloo Regional Police Service. So I'll let you introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Terry Turner. I'm with the Waterloo Regional Police Service. I spent the last 3.5 years just prior to being promoted to inspector with our Intimate Partner Violence Unit. That was the first time for me in that unit, and I can tell you it was incredible, the learning curve, and also seeing what our victims go through, to learn how our service responds to it, and also to learn all of our community partners that work towards ending violence against women. But I can tell you we still have a lot more work to do. So yeah, I'm currently in our court division right now, but I still chair the provincial committee, and I'm still very passionate about intimate partner violence issues.
Yeah, great. I was hoping we could sort of go through what a typical, if there is a typical DV call looks like, sounds like, and what the issues for the police look like when you get one of those calls, how it all breaks down. If you could talk us through it, that'd be great.
Sure. It's certainly changed a lot. As I mentioned, I've been here for just over 22 years. And when I was first on the road, patrol officers responded to the calls, and they took the call start to finish. And it was a tough call. It's still a very tough call to take on the road. And I think partly because they're extremely unpredictable calls. So you really have no idea what you're getting into. You have no idea what the range of emotions are going to be. It can be a verbal argument. It can be a physical assault, all the way up to a homicide. So, and it can change as well during the call. So when you arrive on the call, it can be calm, parties are separated, you're trying to find out from both parties what happened, and that's where it becomes problematic as well. So especially if there's no immediate evidence of any kind of abuse, and we all know there's physical abuse, there's emotional abuse, there's financial abuse, substance abuse issues, and oftentimes there's children involved too. So they're extremely complex issues to deal with. And so our unit has now evolved over the years. So probably about 2008, we created a special unit specifically for intimate partner violence. So we now have a unit with 20 officers who are specifically trained in intimate partner violence issues. They get specific training on risk management, on trauma-informed interviewing, and specific issues related to intimate partner violence. So our unit now, our patrol unit still takes the initial call. They still respond to that call. But once they form grounds for charges, then our specialized unit takes over. So that's really important, because I think we've got now better trained officers who understand some of these complex dynamics within intimate partner violence to actually start addressing some of those more underlying issues. And you know, I think we know that, and I think we heard from Julie as well, that you can be so involved and wrapped up and not necessarily even understand what's going on. So to try to explain to a police officer or to somebody else what's happening when you've been put in that situation and abused for so long, and told you're worthless, told nobody's going to listen to you, nobody's going to believe you, it's a really complex situation. So we understand that victims will take several times before they're actually even able to successfully leave their partners. We also know that a lot of families get back together. They want to get back together, and that happens often. So it can be very frustrating. You know, you're trying to understand what causes a person to stay in this relationship. You're trying to get them help all of the supports that they might need. It's a really complex issue, but I do think with the new setup, relatively new, we've been doing it for quite some time. So we're not located in a police station. It's a little bit more comfortable for victims to come to have that wraparound service. So we have counselors on scene, we have family and children services there, we have financial counselors on scene. We really have tried to put everybody together in the same building to provide those supports to our victims. But those calls can be just so dynamic and so difficult, and they're generally extremely lengthy investigations. So even the patrol officer arriving on scene, they can be at that call for 2 to 3 or more hours before it even gets turned over to our specialized unit. And then we can spend another 5, 6, 8 hours, an entire shift, and then there's more follow-up after that. So the calls are extremely complex and extremely unpredictable. So they make them very difficult to deal with in the same consistent fashion. But we have created really good support for victims now. But one of my biggest issues is since the unit was created, we've had about 6,000 domestic calls a year. And that number has remained constant. So we really haven't seen any reduction in that number. And I think part of the reason for that is we provide great service to our victims, but we're really not addressing the root cause of the problem, which is the offenders. And I think we heard from both survivors there say, we need to get the offenders to therapy. We need to get them to take more responsibility for their actions. There's a lot of studies coming out now that say incarceration isn't the best answer. Treatment during incarceration isn't the best answer. So we really need to look at a more immediate response to the offenders as well.
Sure. We often hear that, in terms of the shelter approach, we often hear that, shelters are more of an imprisonment for the victim or survivor, and not the perpetrator. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely would. I think that the shelters, we have an amazing relationship with the Women's Crisis Services here, which provide our shelters. They're overwhelmed, understaffed as well. They are full consistently, but it is an extremely difficult transition for somebody to leave their home, as you heard from Julie, to have to maybe leave her dog. If you have children, how does that work? It's a very difficult situation to navigate. You're moving into a whole new place where you have no friends, no family, no supports. You have the people that work there, but it's got to be extremely difficult to leave what you know to go to a shelter. And I know a lot of people choose not to do that. A lot of people go, they leave, they come back. It's very difficult. It's an absolutely necessary purpose for emergency situations where, violence is high and where the threat or danger is high. So, there's absolutely a place and a need for them, but it's a very tough situation for anybody to leave their home to go to a shelter.
Yeah. I hear it in the UK that it should be the perpetrator that leaves, and not the survivor.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like I mentioned, with some of that emotional and sometimes even the physical abuse, it's really hard to see. And it's really hard. You've got two people providing two very different versions of a story. And if you have no physical evidence to back that up, to say, oh, I can see that you've got a black eye, so obviously he assaulted you. But if it's emotional or financial abuse, or that underlying threatening that if you go to the police, I'll kill you or I'll kill your family, those underlying issues are really difficult to kind of weed through and get to the bottom of it and understand and get to the point to lay charges. And until we get to that point where we can lay charges, we can't make anybody leave the house. So the victim is left in that horrible situation if we can't prove that an offense has taken place. So it's a really tough situation for people to be in.
So how do you go about imposing restraining orders? So you've attended a call and you're investigating. What does that process look like to impose a restraining order?
So if we as the police are able to lay charges, then the accused would be put on terms generally not to have any association with the victim, not to attend that location or address. But it's only once we get to that point of charges that the police can impose those terms. If they want to get a peace bond on their own, they can go to a judge or a JP and apply for that. It's not a straightforward process. It's not a simple process. And I'll tell you, during COVID and during the pandemic, that has become even harder to get. on your own. So it's not a
Yeah.
simple process, and it needs to be streamlined. It needs to become more available to people who need it. Sometimes the victims are even turned away at courts and told to go back to the police to get grounds, that there are grounds to lay the charges. And so it sometimes becomes very cyclical where we cannot help our victims.
Sure. And if you know, if they or you manage to secure one, how are they enforced? How do you know that he or her hasn't approached the survivor? How can you tell?
So yeah, that's a great point. It's very difficult. So our unit of 20 officers that are dedicated to responding to the calls, we also have a high risk unit who monitor some of our more high risk offenders, but we don't have the capability to monitor them 24/7. We certainly don't have the capability to sit on their house and do surveillance to see when they leave, to see where they're going, to see who they're meeting with. That makes it very difficult for us. We just don't have the resources to do that. On occasion, the offender will be allowed a release if he agrees to wear a monitoring bracelet, and that is something that's similar, but it's very one-sided. And it is a lifetime monitoring. We sometimes get notifications of that. Sometimes the technology doesn't work, but it's very difficult for us to monitor any of those cases. So as I mentioned, we have 6,000 calls a year. About 1,300 of those result in charges. So imagine trying to monitor 1,300 offenders, and that's all varying ranges, right? You know, from a very minor mischief, maybe a first-time offender, but also all the way up to a very serious strangulation case or attempt homicide case even. So I think Julie's exactly right. We need stiffer penalties. We need more measures in place. We need more social agencies to address some of those issues for our offenders to actually get to the root of the problem. But it's very difficult for us to monitor our offenders.
Yeah, so I guess the technology could play a part in that. As you said, there is some degree of electronic monitoring, but perhaps it could be expanded or improved to more people. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I think one of the issues that we have with the monitoring devices that we do have is it only monitors the offender. So we can put, you know, radiuses in place for where they can or can't go. But if the victim's out in public somewhere and the offender's out in public and they neither have any idea where each of them are, then we can't do anything about that. You know, we're never going to get notified that they're about to meet at any point in time like that.
Yeah, and I guess that's where sort of a system like ours could potentially come in, because the survivor unit has that mobile zone around them, so that, you know, you can manage those live situations and try and prevent those, you know, those encounters as much as possible. Anyway, obviously,
absolutely,
very complicated. So what's next for Waterloo Regional Police Force?
So we're continuing to expand our unit. You know, I think even having a dedicated unit of 20 officers responding to that high number of calls is still very difficult for us. Like I said, with our high risk team, the number of people that they monitor is too high. So what we're really looking to do is to find more efficient ways to actually respond to calls. We're looking to, one of the areas that I think we need to improve on, as I've already mentioned, is how we respond to our offenders. So right now we have a special pilot project with Women's Crisis Services, and Julie actually mentioned it, where the counselor was right there when she came in. You know, I like to point out that the Family Violence Project is not a police station, so it's a much nicer location for victims to come to. There's not as much pressure. They don't feel like uniforms are looking at them. They're not concerned about that stigma about going to a police station, and we have all of the services available to them there. So we have been kind of a showcase for the rest of Ontario and for Canada. Peel Regional Police recently came to us to look at our model of how we're doing things. They've just started up their own specialized unit, about twice the size of ours, which given their population makes sense. But we have to do this. We have to get better at how we're responding to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. I think the issue, as I mentioned, isn't changing. So in the last at least 15 years, our numbers have not really changed at all. So we're not getting to the root of the problem. And I really think that we need to start focusing on the offenders to figure out what are they missing? You know, what supports don't they have? How do we get immediate counseling and therapy to them? And how do we actually stop the cycle? We talk about it being a cycle of violence, and that's exactly what it is. Our repeat and recidivism rate is extremely high. It's probably between 60 and 80%, where we see the same people over and over again. One of the other issues that Julie talked about was justice. And we recently had a high-risk offender who he has been charged countless times with intimate partner violence offenses. He's been released every single time on a release order with terms, and he continues to breach those terms. And so just last week, we arrested him for breaching those terms, for contacting the victim. We put him in jail. We held him for a bail hearing, and the next morning, the judge released him again on the exact same terms with the exact same order. So, you know, I think in intimate partner violence, we often think of it as homicide prevention, especially in cases with strangulation. Julie talked about being strangled as well. We think of those people as future killers. There are a lot of studies, a lot of reviews that show that men who strangle will eventually kill. A woman who's been strangled one time is 1,000 times more likely to die from intimate partner violence. So there's some staggering statistics there. And if you think that he got 30 days of intermittent weekends, I'm not sure how effective that is. I'm not sure that that is going to deter or prevent him from going right back out and committing the exact crimes with another partner. I don't think he's been rehabilitated. I don't think he's learned. I don't think he's changed in those 30 days. So we need to do better. We need to certainly address the root cause of the problem.
Yeah. So you sort of touched on the judge's response, the criminal justice response. Do you think there's something, the sort of the government level that needs to change? Is it further up the chain, as it were?
Absolutely. I think there are lobbyists, and I think that there are, people like survivors who are pushing for these kinds of changes, but it really all stems from education. And that's one of the focuses of our unit. We actually created a multi-sectoral team to address strangulation offenses. So Bill C-67 came into effect not that long ago. It sets out a specific offense for strangulation. It recognizes the seriousness of strangulation. And I think that's making steps like that are really important. It puts it in its own category. It has its own set of charges, its own set of consequences, or, I think we need to do more like that. But with that, so our group is looking to now actually take it to the judiciary and start educating the judges on the seriousness of strangulation, so that when they're actually taking that into consideration for sentencing purposes, they actually fully understand how dangerous strangulation is. We had one case recently that was actually made case law. He got a 7-year sentence, and that was the best sentence that we have ever seen in a strangulation case. But one of the comments that the judge still made was, it couldn't have been that serious because she didn't even lose consciousness. And that's just, unfortunately, a lack of education. So we really need to do more education and make sure that people understand the seriousness, not only of strangulation, but of domestic violence, intimate partner violence across the board, and look at ways to actually address the root causes of those issues.
Yeah. I mean, you're clearly doing such tremendous work to help victims and survivors, in the nicest possible way. I hope one day that your department won't be needed, but unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of work to do there.
That would be ideal. I think in my 3.5 years there, that's what was most disappointing for me, is that we haven't actually reduced the incidents. And I think everybody working in this sector would agree that we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. So that 6,000 call number is not even a fraction of what's actually happening out there. And that's the scariest part, right? Is we're only getting the smallest percentage that have the courage, that are strong enough, that have the supports to actually come forward and report it. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, it feels like we might be going, towards the right direction. Thank you very much, Terry. I'm conscious of time. We've got sort of 5 or 6 minutes left, so I thought we might try and take a few questions.
Sure.
So I'll just see if I can. This. What have we got? Okay. So question for you, Terry. What do police tell victims if they are not ready to leave? Is there anything the police can tell them to try and keep them alive as safe as possible?
We go through a risk assessment with our victims. And I think, we try to highlight the dangerousness of their situation, but it really is a delicate process, right? We're very happy that somebody has actually made that initial call to us, but we want to try to express to victims that we have all of the supports, we have what's necessary for them to actually make that leap to leave. But it's often been said that it's 7 or more times for a victim to actually leave an abusive situation. So I think we just want to assure them that we're there for them. If they're ready, then we'll do whatever we humanly can to help them. We have a lot of services available through victim services, through women's crisis services, but we also want to impart on them the seriousness of staying and the dangers of staying. And so when we go through that risk assessment form, we can actually come up with a quantifiable number of what their risk is. So while we may not tell them exactly what that number is, we'll try to explain what level of seriousness and danger they're in. And I think we even heard it from Julie. People often will minimize the effects of domestic violence. They often don't say how serious it is. Julie's talking about getting punched in the face multiple times. Who has to go through that and then is not able to leave that at the end, right? This is part of that cycle of abuse and violence and not truly understanding how dangerous it is. And so I think we want to try to express to people that they are in danger and we want to make sure that they're safe. So we'll do whatever we can to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, another question. Somebody wants to know what training is provided for police to respond to DV calls.
So our initial patrol officers that respond get training at Ontario Police College. So they get courses on domestic violence and intimate partner violence there. And then we do subsequent training when they come back from that training. And then before they can actually go into our unit, into our specialized unit, they attend a 2-week course again at Ontario Police College, specifically related to intimate partner violence. Like I said, about risk assessment, about trauma-informed interviewing, and just about safety planning for our victims.
Yeah. Is there any right person for the role?
That's a good question. We have a range of men and women in the unit, and I think it's more about the person that's in the unit. Sometimes a female victim does not want to talk to a male police officer about what's happened to them. We'll certainly amend that and have a female investigator attend for them. But I have incredible investigators in that unit of both genders, so that's kind of a personal preference. I think anybody that comes into that unit has to be caring, compassionate. One of the things that I've been very strong on is we have to believe our victims. So as police, we kind of look for those logical answers and all of those clues and everything leading up to a nice, neat and tidy case. It doesn't work like that way. In intimate partner violence, especially with trauma can affect the brain, it can affect memory, it can affect how they retell their story. There can be gaps in their story. So I think we just really need to be sensitive to that and understand that somebody who has been abused and traumatized isn't necessarily going to provide a nice, neat package of how things happen. And we have to work with them to get the best case possible going forward.
Right. Okay, we've got time for one more. You mentioned COVID making responding to DV calls more difficult. Could you expand on the why and whether that's affected DV rates at all?
Sure. So it certainly did. We saw probably anywhere between an 8 and a 15% increase in our calls in intimate partner violence. And I still think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think during COVID, it's been difficult for healthy people to adapt and to adjust. And I think we've seen more not necessarily violence, but arguments between healthy couples, trying to navigate the pandemic. You're now stuck at home, maybe with somebody for 24 hours. Your options of getting out of the house are limited. Your options of calling for help are limited. So some people may be even further trapped in that cycle of violence, whereas their partner may have gone to work before and they could have called a friend. Now that's not happening. So I think COVID has really just exponentially increased the stress on families, financial stress, emotional stress. I just think there are so many more factors that COVID has brought on to make it even more difficult for people to leave relationships that are abusive.
Yeah, and has it increased the rates of incidences, do you think?
We have seen an increase for sure. I would say that I was maybe a little bit surprised that it didn't increase it more. So I expected it to go up even higher, and maybe it did, and we just don't know. We don't know what we don't know. And again, we know that those 6,000 calls are just the tip of the iceberg. So unfortunately, it's really hard to quantify what's happening when you just don't know and people aren't reporting it.
Yeah, sure. And just like that, we've run out of time. Thanks very much, Terry, and thanks, Julie. I'd just like to say thanks to all the contributors, all the guests, Blue Line for hosting. I truly believe that with a concerted effort led by the government, with some support from technology companies such as ourselves and police colleagues, we can begin to make a greater impact and improve outcomes for survivors. So if anyone's got any more questions, please do get in contact. If anyone would like to find out any more info about our system, the attentive bilateral DV system, please do also get in contact. Thank you. Brianna.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us today for this engaging conversation on domestic violence in Canada. A special thank you to Inspector Terry Turner and Julie Waters for taking part today, and to Matt and our sponsors, Attenti and Prod360 Inc. for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about the technology, visit prod360.ca or attentigroup.com. Thanks again, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.